your evolution is one of your greatest opportunities in life. Because when you can see that the universe is serving this to you as an act of grace, because it wants you to change what you're doing, to change your path, because it knows that you know that you are not aligned with your true self. So we are, for the first time, walking through a Gene Keys profile, to be more specific, Courtney's Gene Keys profile. We're going to go through each sphere, what they mean, her gene key in that sphere, her line in that sphere, just some contemplations from me, some experiences from her. If you missed the first video, you can go back and check that out. We sort of laid down the plan and a broad overview of terms and how the gene keys work, and also tackled the sphere of life's work already. And today we're going to move on to the pathway of challenge and then the sphere of evolution. Okay, so starting at the pathway of challenge. The pathway of challenge is all about lessons and cycles. It is how the universe grabs your attention and makes you pay attention, because it's going to bring the discomfort of the shadow to your life over and over and over again until you are able to see the pattern at first. That's all it takes, is seeing the pattern, getting some awareness to it. And once we do that, we've got a choice to choose differently than something we've done in the past.
So do you mean it grabs your attention so that you can make a change and move forward?
Exactly. Grabs your attention in that it's going to be suffering, so that you will turn towards it and pay attention instead of turning away from it and doing something to distract yourself.
I got you. So this specific challenge is what's supposed to wake you up to look for something different.
Yeah. So remember,
in life in general,
the sphere of your life's work and the sphere of evolution are both conscious.
Yeah.
Meaning that we can make choices that affect whether we end up in the gift frequency or we end up in the shadow frequency.
Okay.
Compared with like our radiance and our purpose, for example, those are unconscious. So we can't do something directly to impact how that frequency shows up in our life. But here, this is very cyclical, like I've said a few times. So it's going to, the same lesson is going to keep coming back again and again and again until you choose to handle that from the frequency of the gift.
So would you say anytime you need to go into a transition or make a change in any phase of life, this cycle or this, like these two things will start to cycle through?
Absolutely. Yeah. You'll notice that the universe will specifically key in on this thing because it's the thing that like is very deep annoyance for you. Like it's a very deep, like, yeah, I just wish this thing would leave me alone.
Like a frustration.
Exactly. So for me, this is the shadow of expectation, like, which is my inability to let go of control and trying to manipulate everything that happens around me. But if I'm able to let go of those expectations, then I fall into the gift of detachment.
And it's like a doorway you can then walk through.
This is one of a couple very specific like trigger release points for energy in your Gene Keys profile.
Okay.
So this profile or this key, if you can let go enough to fall into the gift, and your IQ is another example in the Venus sequence, and then also your culture in the Pearl sequence are all these places where a ton of energy is being held back if we can only learn to trust a little bit and surrender and let go into the gift.
Okay. That's an interesting way to think about it.
And these cycles typically are going to show up in 7-year patterns, and I'm not going to get too in depth on what that looks like right now, but let's just say on August 15th, when you were 3 years old, something happened. On August 15th, when you're 10 years old, that same thing is going to fire back through. And on August 15th, when you're 17 years old, that same thing is going to come back through. And your mission Your dharma is to, as you grow in wisdom, handle that thing differently.
Okay.
Now, this discomfort that comes from your evolution, I just want to talk about how we need to think about handling or dealing with this, because it's not that the tendency is either to run away from it or pretend like it's not there. But the real thing we need to do is actually turn towards this suffering, towards this gift from the universe, because ultimately it's what drives our evolution. And so in the Gene Keys, we talk about this 3-part system for working towards accepting these difficult things. And this really, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, he talks about it in the 25th Gene Key, which has one of these words as the gift, acceptance. So the 3-part process is, number 1, allow. So in the beginning, it's just recognizing the pattern, having awareness on it. You don't have to try and change it. You're not going to change it. You just have to see that it's there, and you have to allow it happen and just take it in and think, man, that's interesting. I didn't consciously want to act that way, but that's what I did.
You're the observer.
Exactly. Then phase 2 is accept. So at that point, it is not only, okay, yes, this thing happened, but it's understanding that it's a part of who I am. And it's an important part of who I am, because it's going to be the fuel that drives me forward. And then finally, we get to the 3rd part, which is embracing it. And embracing it is really seeing it as God, seeing it as divinity coming down as a path for you to change who you are and step into your truest and highest self.
But that 3-step process does not include changing it.
Does not include changing the pattern? Correct. Yeah. Well, interestingly, what you'll see as you accept the pattern and eventually embrace it, it changes itself. There's not much that you have to do, which is hard, because we want so badly to be in control, and we want so badly to have to do something to make this change happen. But it's the not doing that makes it come through.
So in not doing it, you essentially, the frequency changes, like that you jump from shadow to gift. Is that what the thought is?
Yeah. I mean, remember, like we talked about before, you're constantly moving between them, right? The city is in the shadow. The gift is certainly in the shadow.
Right.
So it's not that you're jumping up to the gift and that's it, the end. This thing, as your evolution, is going to keep coming back again and again, and it's going to gradually get harder so that you can gradually work with it more and more.
Okay.
Now, as I mentioned before, you are in conscious control of your response here. So if you keep your eyes peeled for this in your life, you're going to see it, and you're going to be able to choose differently. And that's what's holding back so much life force, so much energy, is you running away from this pattern takes a lot of time, energy, and effort.
Yeah.
And if instead of running away, you could use it as fuel, it is such a huge engine. And we'll talk about the programming partners in a second, and how that literally is, or I guess figuratively, is an engine that drives our actions in the outer world. So let's talk about it now. Why not? This is a feedback loop that happens between your activation sequence. Is unique here in that there are 2 pairs of programming partners. And it's important, as you look at your profile, you look at your life's work and your evolution as a single unified field of frequency.
Because they're programming partners.
Because they're programming partners, meaning they work off of one another.
Right.
And then your radiance and your purpose are also programming partners. So you want to look at that as one unified field. So although this is 4 spheres, it's really only 2 fields of energy. And they are just there to mutually reinforce one another. And that could be in the shadow, and it's going to drive you deeper and deeper and deeper down into those shadow patterns, because they mutually enforce one another. For example, mine here, like I said, is the shadow of expectation in my evolution, and the shadow of failure in my life's work.
Yeah.
So doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that I have expectations. When they don't get met, I see that as a failure.
Yeah.
And that drives me deep into a hole.
Yeah.
In your case,
That makes
it's
sense too.
indifference, right? Indifference
And inertia.
and inertia. So indifference, I don't feel enough of a driver to make a move, which is what allows me to break the inertia. However, the cool part is the same thing is also true at the gift frequency. So for me, that's detachment and preservation. So when I am able to detach from my expectations, instead of seeing that thing as a failure, I'm able to preserve whatever is useful from that experience and carry it forward with me, because that experience was really just shaping me for whatever comes next anyway.
Yeah.
There is no failure if we can zoom out far enough.
Right.
We in our human brains want things to go a certain way. We expect things to go a certain way. And when they don't, we put failure on that. But there is no failure and there is no success. There is only the workings of how things are going.
That's such a big one for you.
So hard. Another thing that we want to talk about with programming partners is the gene keys, and maybe I'll throw this up on the video here. They can get overlaid on a wheel, just like the I Ching, and that wheel sort of ties to also the signs of the zodiac and the movements of the sun around the earth over the course of a year. And so as we lay these things out on a wheel, what you'll see is the programming partners are exactly opposite of one another on that wheel all the way across. So just a fun little tidbit there. Your life's work signifies the sun when it comes to your gene keys profile. So all of these spheres, if you didn't know, are tied to planets. Ultimately, the system, as much as it hurts my soul to say it, is based off of astrology.
It's astrology for men. That's what I say.
So life's work is the sun. It represents the yang energy. It represents what you do in the world.
Yeah.
Your evolution is the earth, and it is the yin energy. And that is what is the turbine that drives your doing, if that makes sense. So this is the world, the earth's way of getting you to evolve. And if you think about Gaia and our place on Gaia, its job is to provide the environment to hold all of our collective souls so that we can march toward reunion. And even looking at the quote unquote evolution of life from a single-celled organism up to an invertebrate to a mollusk to a land animal to us, the engine of evolution, the engine of challenge, which the earth provides, is what is driving that growth, that change, and eventual reunion.
Got it.
So as I've said more than a handful of times at this point, your evolution is one of your greatest opportunities in life. Because when you can see that the universe is serving this to you as an act of grace, because it wants you to change what you're doing, to change your path, because it knows that you know that you are not aligned with your true self. And when we're able to start to make that change, it is what allows the unconscious things below it to start to shine through. And that's why this is such a big release of energy, is because right on the other side of this sphere is the sphere of radiance, which is the light pouring out of you into the world. A really important place to look for this sphere of evolution is not just in yourself, but in your relationships also. So relationships are a mirror of us. And sometimes it's easier to see this sphere of evolution in a partner, a child, a sibling. Like it comes out for you, and you'll see it in them maybe a little bit easier.
That's actually what draws my attention to it, is I start to get really agitated by my particular keys, like that cycle in other people. It starts to really bother me, and then I'm like, where is it in my life?
Anytime something is bothering us, it's because we have the pattern.
But this specific cycle in other people makes me I'm so intolerant of it. It makes me so mad.
And it's probably because it is conscious. You notice it much more easily than some of the stuff that lies a little bit deeper. Okay. Lastly, before we get into Courtney's specific gene key, which is 16 line 6, I want to talk about the lines a little bit for this key. So line number 1 is all about the self and empowerment, and specifically self-esteem. So if you're in the shadow and you're a first line in your evolution, your self-esteem, I bet, isn't going to be the best. Also can lead to a lot of self-centeredness. If we put ourselves in front and center over everyone else, which is the first line's tendency, they turn in and prioritize themselves, which there's nothing wrong with that, as long as that prioritization of yourself is so that you can then return it in service.
Yeah. And
that's really the key with this first line is service. It takes you out of yourself and recognizing that this turning in isn't there so that you can protect yourself or be in yourself. It's so you can take your gifts and be secure in them and understand them and then serve them back out into the world. And that gift will start to emerge, that creativity, when you can get out of the victim mindset, when you can see that the universe isn't trying to harm you, but it's the opposite. It's trying to help. And when that happens, when we recognize that it's not happening to us, but for us, everything changes.
Yeah.
Second line is passion and relationships. So the big issue with second lines, which you'll remember in Life's Work is keynoted the dancer. Here, it's about being unself-conscious. So the opposite of the first line is really the issue with the second line, meaning it must be the other person's fault. I'm projecting everything out because I can't see it in myself because I don't have enough self-consciousness to make that happen. Self-awareness, yes. Thank you. So the answer on the second line, if you have a second line evolution, is to turn inward, the opposite of the first line. First line, your job is to be inside and then share that gift outward so that you're not as self-obsessed. The second line is to look in so that we can own our shit and stop blaming other people for it.
Okay.
Third line is about energy and experience. And the problem or the challenge that a third line will see is avoidance. They will do anything and everything to not have to feel the problem. Part of that also is looking for approval. And so the third line needs to make sure that they're not doing things so that other people tell them that they're doing a good job.
It's about external validation.
Exactly.
Rather than trusting your insides.
Right. And what we need to do to make that avoidance a little less present is to do things for the sake of doing them because you want to do them. Fourth line is about love and community. And the big challenge here is comparison. We start to want what other people want or wonder why we're not in a place where we think we should be. And the way to deal with that one is to forget the small stuff. But when you forget the small stuff, the comparison doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we have. It doesn't matter what kind of car we have, what kind of house we have. What matters is what your soul is. What matters is how much love you have in your life. And when you can remember that, comparison goes straight out the window. Fifth line is about power and projection. So that is the challenge here is about amplification. It's about an obsession with amplification, with getting bigger, getting more power,
always
getting
better.
Stronger. Exactly.
It's never enough.
Exactly.
Got it.
And the way that we deal with that fifth line is to become vulnerable and to recognize that you are not all powerful. And to see, though, that vulnerability is your strength. Because when we are able to lower our defenses completely, that's the only way that we can really and truly never be hurt.
Because you can let love in.
Exactly. And then line number 6, which is Courtney's line in this sphere here, also my line in this sphere, is keynoted education and surrender. And the issue or the challenge that pops up here is aspiration. And what I mean by that is we see this giant vision of the future and we aspire to it, but we don't believe that it's possible.
Man, we really do struggle with that.
And the way that we need to get to the other side of that aspiration to make that aspiration into reality is to believe again. At some point, a 6 line lost their belief in the big dream. But at the same time, they cannot, 6 lines cannot let go of that dream. So although you stop believing in it, it's still there nagging at you in the back of your brain. And so we have this aspiration that one day, sometime, this thing's going to happen, but we don't actually believe that.
Yeah.
It's just there in the back. Because if we actually believed it, our lives would look totally different.
Mm-hmm. So my 2 spheres, the challenge really ties in a lot with the 6 line here.
Yes.
Makes a lot of sense.
Same with mine too.
Yeah.
Right? Mine is expectation, detachment, celebration. So detachment and surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And yours is versatility and mastery, which comes about through both of those things, actually, education and surrender.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to talk about with that pathway of challenge is that you need to think about the spheres on both sides of it. So this was a big shift for me, as I saw my life's work as something separate from my evolution, which I already told you they're a unified field.
Yeah.
And so I thought that the challenge was just my evolution.
That's what I thought too.
But in reality, the challenge is the life's work and the evolution combined. So it's both sides of that pathway are what present that challenge.
The challenge is breaking the cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how those two are connected.
Yeah.
More so than going from the shadow to the gift within that specific sphere.
Okay.
Courtney's key for the sphere of evolution is the 16th, and she is a line 6. 16th key moves from indifference to mastery, and it's the path of versatility. I want to kick this off by reading a quote from the 16th gene key. It's on page 111 if you have the book. And this is written from a Holocaust survivor. Her name is Ellie Weasel, I think is how you say that. Sorry if I butchered it. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. And I think that really sums up this key in a big way. Mm-hmm. When you think about indifference, I think one of the first things that comes to mind for me is this idea of the diffusion of responsibility, is what he calls it, which is basically, well, everyone else is acting this way. Nobody else is doing anything about this. Why should I? Mm-hmm. Or another part of this indifference is there's so many other people working on this thing. Why should I? Mm-hmm. Both of those lead to the same place, though, which is this feeling that I can't do anything about where I am, and so I just shouldn't care about it. Mm-hmm. That diffusion of responsibility is massive. Like, if you think about it when it comes to poverty, there is a massive, by far the majority of humans on this planet that are maybe not hungry every day, but are not doing well. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot of people on this planet who are starving every single day. Mm-hmm. And yet we have this select few people who are thriving while that is happening. Mm-hmm. And that is the shadow of indifference. Those people that have are looking out at those have-nots and saying, well, you haven't done enough in your life in order to get where I am. And I hate to break it to you and to me and to you, but it's not just the 1%. It's not just the billionaires. It's not just the millionaires. Like, I'm sitting here in front of a phone that I have and with the time to sit and do a podcast, and I'm not doing anything about it either.
I think a really good example of indifference is that I can't think of what the theory is called, but it's like if something happens on the street, like somebody's getting murdered, someone would probably step in, but everybody says not me, and that person just in broad daylight has something terrible happen to them because they're like, I can't make the change here.
Exactly. Yeah, it very much is like lemming syndrome. Like, just they didn't do it, so I'm not going to do it. But that's the collective shadow frequency that's driving that behavior. Another really big thing with indifference is the focus on the inessential while you're indifferent to what actually matters. So what I mean by that is focusing on how you look today, or focusing on how this person perceives you, or focusing on how much money you're making, or what kind of car you drive, or what kind of phone you have, instead of focusing on how much love you have in your life, or helping solve this problem of poverty. Mm-hmm. It's a focus on the inessential things that have been programmed into us by the collective shadow. Again, because everyone else is doing it and I need to keep up with them. One of the big drivers of indifference, I think, is also making excuses. Mm-hmm. So a big one that I know you have and that I have,
let's hear it,
is I don't have enough time.
Oh yeah, time.
Time is, I'll do that later, or I don't know enough now. I need to learn more before I do something, or have to get my kid to school in the morning and then I have to work 10 hours and I have to do X, Y, and Z. And so how could I possibly have time to help somebody?
It's also piling on inessential things so that you don't have time to focus on what matters. That's what I do.
Exactly. If we look at this as a connection to the 9th gene key,
inertia,
which is inertia, we can very clearly see that we don't have what it takes inside of us to overcome the inertia because I am indifferent to the problem. Mm-hmm. If I had enthusiasm and cared deeply, inertia would not matter at all. Mm-hmm. So these things are tied so intimately together. Like, getting the energy to get started isn't there because you're indifferent about the problem in the first place.
There's something about that description that doesn't sit perfectly well with me, because
lastly is the city of mastery. And what you'll see as we go through Courtney's activation sequence, and we'll probably do Venus sequence and Pearl eventually, mm-hmm. is the cities are going to be much shorter than the shadow and the gift.
Yeah.
And that isn't because you shouldn't spend time thinking about them. In fact, you should really be spending about 90% of your time thinking about the gift and the city, and only about 10% of your time thinking about the shadow, mm-hmm. which is opposite from what most people do. We tend to get hyper-focused on what we're doing wrong or the bad things showing up in our life. But if we want the gift and the city, that's what we need to be thinking about. That's what we need to be seeing. That's what we need to be recognizing. The city, really, all of them are saying the same thing.
Right.
Which is why it can be a little bit challenging to talk about them. The other thing that makes it tough is that it is very deep, and words, it's almost ineffable. Mm. Words do not do a great job of describing these cities. There's something that you have to feel, and the ability that Richard Rudd has to bring these things forward and to put a feeling out into the world is incredible. Oftentimes, even he resorts to having to tell a story to get the cities across. Mm-hmm. Because that's how our brains are wired, to be able to see these topics like this. We need to feel a certain way. Mm-hmm. And that's what stories do, is they put us, they put us in a specific place. Yeah. So I'm going to mention just a couple of things with the city of mastery. The first is that this is what is called a miracle city. So it is one of a handful of cities. So, for example, my purpose, the 60th city, is a miracle city My SQ, the 35th city, is boundlessness, is a miracle city. Mm-hmm. And what the miracle cities mean are that they literally lead to miracles happening, or what we would consider miracles happening in the world. Mm-hmm. So the 35th city of boundlessness, it's called a miracle city because when you get your consciousness to that place, you understand that the constraints of time, and understand's not the right word because that's mental, but you know that time and space are just a part of this illusion that we are in. Mm-hmm. That there is no time. All that's here is now. And when we know that those things aren't real at our core, mm-hmm. we get to break those laws, meaning you can time travel and you can fly. And Richard Rudd talks about like the old Eastern movies of people flying across rooftops as not being fables or stories, but these are real things that have carried forward through the ages of when these miracle cities were present, more present on this planet. And they're going to come back. Mm-hmm. But here, the miracle is mastery. And the reason that it's a miracle, again, a story is the best way that I have here. So I want you to think about the movie The Matrix. And Neo is recently unplugged from his little incubation tub. And he takes the, I think, blue pill or red pill, I can't remember, whatever one it is, to go down and to be able to see things as they truly are. Mm-hmm. And then he has to start to train to be able to operate in the matrix and to see through the things that are out there. And he has to go and try and jump from one building to another building. And he keeps falling over and over again because he doesn't believe at his core in boundlessness, mm-hmm. right? He is still limited by the confines of the matrix. Mm-hmm. When he starts to believe is when he starts to make that jump. But when it comes to mastery, one of the things that he needs to do is learn things. And one of the things that they do in order for him to learn is he goes into this kind of dojo looking space and he goes and has a fight with Morpheus. Mm-hmm. And he gets his ass kicked. And then they take a little program on a little disc and they put it into the computer and they push the download button and they shift over to Neo's face and you see his eyes light up and he says, "I know Kung Fu." That is the city of mastery. It is literally an instantaneous understanding of whatever topic you need to understand, mm-hmm. that gets downloaded into your brain without having to learn it, without having to memorize it, without having to think of anything. Mastery is just the knowing of things immediately. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So because this is the pathway of challenge or the breakthrough, whatever it is, pathway of challenge, mm-hmm. and this is driving growth, is it more likely that somebody is able to reach the city frequency of the evolution because you're pushing forward in that?
So, trick answer. I'm sure you didn't mean it to be a trick question.
It wasn't a trick question.
It's going to be a trick answer. Remember that these spheres are not actually independent of one another.
Right.
So we look at it that way because it's easier for our brain to understand. But if you bust into a city, all the cities come.
Right. But I'm saying, like, is that kind of the doorway into the cities is like through that specific frequency for you because that is your pathway of evolution?
Could be one of them.
Okay.
Maybe another way to reframe this to try and gain some understanding is there is actually two more pathways of challenge mm-hmm. in the Gene Keys profile, mm-hmm. or what would be the equivalent of the pathway of challenge.
Right.
So IQ and EQ in your Venus sequence, and then your core and culture in your Pearl sequence all represent this pathway of challenge. Mm-hmm. And so any of those pathways could be a thing that opens you up to the cities.
Okay.
Ultimately, it could be any of them. The cities are the Gene Keys term for enlightenment.
Right.
Or the Gene Keys term for the dissolution of ego and self and falling into the recognition that everything is one and that we ultimately are a soul having an experience.
Well, that's why one of these like challenge pathways makes the most sense to me to break into enlightenment.
Definitely could be.
Because it's coming up over and over and over.
I mean, I would argue that probably the sphere of purpose is the biggest window, but I think any of them could be.
Okay.
And I say the sphere of purpose because that is the thing that you're here to figure out.
Yeah.
This go around in your being.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's finish up with the 6th line, which is education and surrender. So as a reminder, 6 lines are all about vision. They're all about long-term seeing. It's about God. It's about recognizing that there's so much here that we don't see or understand or know, and believing that the way things are now are not the way that things are going to be forever.
Yeah.
And that there's this other vision, this other place, this heaven on earth that we're going to end up in. Mm-hmm. And it is the 6 lines job to remind everyone else of that. However, 6 lines don't turn on fully until you're about 50 years old.
I tell myself that every day.
So surrender is so important here because up until that point, and even after that point, but especially up until that point, that's what it's going to take, because it's not going to go like you want it to go, because you're not going to figure it out before it's time for you to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And so that means just surrendering to the lessons that are coming your way over and over and over again, so that we can integrate those things, so that we do have the skills, the versatility to do what we need to do in order to actually fulfill or do our part in fulfilling that vision.
Yeah.
And that for me is probably how the 6th line ties in best, is that it is about recognizing that I need time and space and patience to acquire the versatility that I need to solve the big problem that I'm trying to solve.
Yeah.
And then the other piece of it is education, which also intimately ties to versatility, right? The way that we learn new skills is by or through, oftentimes, education. Doesn't need to be, could also be through experience. So one of the things that a 6th line needs to do is understand how all of the other 5 lines are seeing the world.
Yeah.
And so it's an education in that. It's about understanding that most people don't see things the way that you see things. And they have strengths in seeing things that you don't see. It's not to say that the 6th line sees this end game and they're like the all-knowing being. Absolutely not. There's a lot of issues that come with being a 6th line.
Yeah.
However, there's a lot to learn from how the other lines, both at the shadow frequency and at the gift frequency, and of course at the city frequency, are showing up in the world, because you're going to need to integrate all of those pieces in order to solve this grand vision that you've had all along.
So needing the understanding all of the other lines and the things that they bring and the things that they struggle with is what gives you that versatility.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the thing that allows you to see that it keeps you open to the whole picture, like we talked about a few times.
Yeah.
And it gives you, I mean, there's something to be said for acquiring skills throughout your life.
Yeah. Knowing where to go and who to go to.
Exactly. Like my shadow of my life's work, failure, in reality, it's improving. Every failure is improving my versatility, right? I'm carrying those skills forward to be able to solve bigger, harder, more problems. Anything else?
No, I mean, these two spheres and this pathway is of the entire thing is the one that I've disliked and had a hardest time with the most, even though I like see the shadows pretty easily. And talking through this has made me not hate them.
I'm glad that that's the case. These two spheres and this pathway, I think, are hard because we've run from them for so long.
Yeah.
And then when we take the pivot to turn back towards them, it's really a hard pill to swallow. At least it was for me.
Well, and they cause so much suffering. Like that cycle is what causes so much strife in your life. At least for me, it has.
Yeah, for everyone.
Yeah.
Not just you.
Right.
That's why it's here.
So why would you look at it if you're like, I just want to be away from this?
But remember,
you gotta.
Every shadow contains a gift. The whole theme of the Gene Keys.
Yeah.
All right. That wraps up our first pathway and our first two spheres. We are going to go to the other side of the veil in our next podcast, which we're trying to do these once a week. And what I mean by the other side of the veil is we've now come to the pathway of breakthrough. And right in the middle of that pathway of breakthrough is when we flip from conscious to unconscious. And so we are behind the veil because it is not in our conscious awareness. And from there, we're going to talk about the sphere of radiance. And that'll probably be what we do next time. So probably a little bit shorter. And then we will finish up with another shorter one, hopefully, of the pathway of core stability into the sphere of purpose.
Okay.
So that is our plan coming up. And thank you guys for hanging out.
Yay.
Bye.